So let's talk women's football. Now, I've been a fan of women's football for as long as I can remember. In fact, the first time I came across women's football was way back in 2006. Yeah, before women's football went mainstream. Now, going back to 2006, women's football wasn't really popular at the time. Like, so unpopular was was women's football was that the only time that women's football was actually shown on TV was whenever England were playing or Women's FA Cup finals. Now, thankfully, that's no longer the case, but women's football still needs to be showcased more. But I'm not really here to talk about women's football overall, but rather specifically in England. Now, growing up watching women's football, looking at the top flight, the big sides at the time were Arsenal and Everton, and that's what I liked. I liked that rivalry between Arsenal and Everton, going from 2008 to 2010, and I liked that because there was no rivalry between Arsenal and Everton in the men's game, and continuing on from that, looking at where Birmingham City were between 2012 and 2014, they were excelling. Like, they won the FA Cup in 2012, and 2 years later reached the semi-finals of the Champions League, beating Arsenal in the process. Now, that's one thing I liked about women's football. Looking at the product of women's football, where it was from, say, the mid to late 2000s to the early 2010s, I think going up to 2014, I liked that period of women's football because what was going on in the women's game wasn't going on in the men's game. Like, for instance, Liverpool winning back-to-back titles, like that wasn't happening in the men's game. In fact, Liverpool men, they at the time, they hadn't won a title since 1990. So my point there is I liked that what was going on in the women's game wasn't going on in the men's game, but going over the last 10 years, 11 years, we started to see a seismic shift where things that were happening in the women's game were also going on in the men's game. Like, say, for instance, Chelsea and Man City winning trophies. Like, yeah, and I get that because their men's clubs are finally starting to buy into women's football. And that's the same with the likes of Tottenham and Manchester United as well. Like, Liverpool, I'm not sure what's happening with them, but they're buying into the women's game as well, which is something I like. But for me, it's come at a cost of women's football losing its identity. So, how has women's football seemingly lost its identity? Well, thinking about it, going back to 2011, when the WSL first started, we saw women's clubs of men's clubs, namely Arsenal, Chelsea, Liverpool, Everton. We saw those teams. And back then, Arsenal was still dominating. They picked up from where they left off from the old Women's Premier Division. Now, in the years since, we've seen Liverpool win back-to-back titles. You've seen Man City win a title. And also, we've seen Chelsea dominating since 2020. I think they won their first title in 2018. Or was it 2015? I can't remember. But anyway, yeah, we've seen women's football losing its identity, which is due thanks to Premier League clubs buying into women's football, which isn't a bad thing per se. But if you look at the teams that are in the league now. Like, for instance, this season marks the first time where all the clubs from the WSL have a men's team, have a men's Premier League team. Now for me, that I just saw that and I thought to myself, yeah, this is not good for women's football. And I say that as someone who grew up watching football, grew up watching women's football before the rise of Chelsea and Manchester City. Like, when I started watching women's football, like, the biggest team was Arsenal because they were the best and they were the most out there club. I mean, also, Everton did win a couple of trophies here and there. Birmingham City won the Women's FA Cup as well. But I don't think those days are coming back anytime soon. Like, we've even seen the rise of Manchester United, who won their first major piece of silverware just last season, having won the Women's FA Cup. I don't know about you though, but for me, I really don't like where women's football is heading. But that's just my take. What are your thoughts? Now, let's talk about women's football across Europe, because it's not just an identity issue in the women's football in England, but across Europe also. I remember, like, who remembers the old UEFA Women's Cup, the one Arsenal won, where the likes of Frankfurt and Potsdam, they were regular features in European football. But where are they these days? Like, I know Lyon dominates, which is another thing that's good to see in women's football, because the Lyon men, well, they're not doing very well, so let's not talk about them. But Lyon women, they do very well in Europe. Like, we see them win Champions Leagues all the time. So I like that. That's different from the men's game. But there's one thing I don't like in the women's game in Europe, and it's that if you look at the women's La Liga, we see that Real Madrid versus Barcelona is El Clasico. I think to myself, hang on a minute, Real Madrid have already been around for less than 5 years, or a bit more than 5 years. How is Real Madrid Barcelona El Clasico? Like, no, Real Madrid women have never won a title. They're not a big club, and it's something I don't like seeing in the women's game. Like, we're seeing women's teams being paraded as a big club, as though they're the men's team. Like, yes, Manchester United men are big, but Manchester United women are not. They've already been around for how many years? Since 2018, so that's 7 years. Yeah, it took me a long time to do the math. I don't know why, but it is what it is. But anyway, what was I saying? Yes, women's teams being paraded as though they're the men's teams. Like, no. Like, and that's something I can't get my head around, honestly. Like, why? Like, but sticking with Europe, I genuinely believe that, and I know some of you probably won't want to hear this, but for me, I believe that there should be some sort of European Super League in the women's game. Why? Because it just makes sense. Like, if you look at the big teams in the WSL, that's Arsenal, Chelsea, City, United, and then we look at the big teams across Europe. So that's Lyon, Barcelona, Bayern, maybe Wolfsburg. Like, it just makes sense to do that. And in Italy, we have Juventus in there. Like, in fact, sticking with Italian football. Like, I know Juventus have won the last few league titles since 2018, but could somebody tell me what's going on in Italian football in the women's game. Yeah. So my main point about this video is I don't like that women's football is taking after men's football, and it's one of the reasons why I prefer to watch the NWSL rather than European women's football, because the NWSL has its own identity, and that's something I believe that women's football in Europe has seemingly lost. But what are your thoughts on this? How does women's football in Europe create its own identity? I'd like to know your thoughts.